Mr. Cooper, we'll turn to you for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Shukevich, you have operated as a key organizer for the longest ballot committee and served as the official agent for many of the candidates affiliated with the longest ballot committee, correct?
That is correct.
And your brother, Kieran Shukevich, also is an organizer with the longest ballot committee, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and I want to ask you some questions about the recruitment of candidates and the collection of nomination signatures for the longest ballot committee. When you and other organizers from the longest ballot committee were collecting signatures, at times electors would have been presented with multiple nomination forms to sign simultaneously.
That's correct.
Okay. And as you went about collecting signatures and recruiting candidates, the longest ballot committee told prospective candidates that they didn't have to worry about collecting signatures because the longest ballot committee already had collected the 100 or more signatures needed for them to get onto the ballot. Isn't that true?
No, that's not true. You have that a little bit backwards. So we recruit candidates, we get all their names, and then we collect signatures for them. We're not like just collecting signatures for people who said they don't want to run.
So I have a video that you posted on YouTube to the longest ballot committee on August 18th, 2024, in respect of the LaSalle-Imard-Verdun by-election, in which you state that if we're going to break the record for the longest ballot, we need everyone to sign up as soon as possible. We've already collected 100 nomination signatures for you. All you have to do is follow the instructions. So, in fact, you and other organizers for the longest ballot committee were going around with nomination forms that didn't have candidates' names on them. Isn't that correct?
That is not correct.
I'm going to stop you there, Mr. Shukevich, because I have a tweet that was posted by the longest ballot committee on January 22nd, 2024, of you, of Kieran, and of I believe, a Glenn McDonald.
Yeah.
And when you look more closely, this is you, we see where the candidate's name is on the nomination form with signatures. The candidate's name is blank. So that's precisely what you were doing, was going out and collecting signatures, getting electors to sign blank nomination forms, not candidate nomination forms.
That is not accurate.
Well, I just present you with evidence, documentary evidence, that establishes that, in fact, it is accurate. And I want to caution you, sir, but you're testifying before a parliamentary committee, and you have an obligation to answer my questions fully and truthfully. And if you fail to do so, sir, you can be held in contempt of Parliament. And I want to make clear to you that I will not hesitate in using all of the tools available to hold you accountable should you not provide truthful and accurate answers, which up till now you have not. So I'm going to give you one last opportunity to confirm on the record that you went about collecting signatures from electors where the candidate's name was blank. That's what you did, right?
No, that is not accurate. If you would give me a chance to actually respond, you've made quite a few incorrect assumptions here. Where would you like me to begin? With the AI doctored images or with your misunderstanding of what sign up means? So in that video, when I say sign up, what I'm referring to is that these are candidates who have already expressed that they want to run. We then collected their signatures with the candidate name at the top. Obviously, that's the rule.
It was not at the top.
It was at the top. I was there.
It was not at the top.
And then when we say we already have your signatures, you need to finish signing up, that is referring to fill out your forms, book an appointment with the returning officer to do your declaration. This is very straightforward. You have it kind of mixed up. If you want to talk about those AI manipulated photos, I'm happy to do so.
These are, I don't have anything mixed up. What I have are
Respectfully, you do have that mixed
a
up.
YouTube video.
If I can for a moment, Mr. Shukevich.
Yeah.
We operate here on a position that members of Parliament are honourable, and to accuse a member of Parliament of doctoring images, I think you should tread very carefully in that. I don't know about these images, but I'm giving you a warning in terms of, I don't find it funny, sir. I don't think you should find it funny either. Mr. Cooper is correct in what Parliament can do, and perhaps you don't have respect for the individuals sitting at these chairs. Please have respect for the institution and the electors that put us here. Sorry, Mr. Cooper. I think we stopped at about 30 seconds.
Yeah, no. We have never collected signatures with blank candidate names. The Chief Electoral Officer has already testified to you that there's no credible evidence of any
Chief Electoral Officer in his testimony said that your committee initially got caught doing precisely just that. That was his testimony.
Respectfully, Mr. Chair, that it was not his testimony. His testimony was that we collected without an identified candidate, which is true. We wrote all candidates were in the candidate field, and we got people to sign. We said, would you be willing to nominate any and all candidates? It was not
That's what
Cooper.
you did. You just admitted it.
No.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Thank you. We'll now turn to Mr. Lewis for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate it. Thank you to both the witnesses for being here today. Professor Lowen, I'm going to start my questions with you. Ultimately, we're talking about protecting democracy, protecting our elections, which is something that's very important. So I know that you've done work with, as a professor in the Department of Government at Cornell, and also you've done work with the Canadian Election Misinformation Project. And I wondered if you can expand on how AI can be weaponized to distort democratic discourse. Do you believe that Canada's current legal framework is sufficient to address the risks proposed by AI-generated disinformation, misinformation during elections? And what specific reforms would you have in mind?
Well, thanks very much for asking, Mr. Lewis. I appreciate the question very much. Let me just give you a quick insight, which is that Canadian election law has, and I spoke with this actually with the committee in November, so it's quite nice to revisit it. Canadian election law has over time restricted how much can be done by so-called third parties to participate in our elections. So we're talking about advocacy groups or unions or business associations to advertise and be active during political campaigns. The reason why we've done that is because we've sort of come to believe that political parties should be the principal vehicles through which our elections are contested. And this longest ballot committee is actually an interesting example of a group that's acting like a third party or maybe like a political party, but not putting itself into that regulatory framework. So that's something for you to consider. But on the issue of AI and misinformation, I'll just give you the following intuition, perhaps. We regulate the participation of third parties through two things. One is we regulate how much they can spend as a way of trying to limit how much they can speak. So there are very strict spending limits on which individuals or how much third parties can spend and thus engage in speech. And the second thing we regulate is we regulate individuals. So we make individual humans legally responsible for what third parties do. The challenge with artificial intelligence is that it can bring the cost of communication down to zero. So the spending mechanism limit on third parties isn't as effective when the cost of doing something is approaching zero. That's problem one. And problem two is what you might call the agentic problem, that we're not far away from people effectively creating non-human agents who will perpetuate speech during elections. Fake Twitter accounts are one example of this, but you can imagine an AI agent that's designed to create political advertisements and then put them out onto the web. It's not an individual putting them on, it's an autonomous agent, and it's doing it at essentially zero cost as it uses social media to spread itself. So what's needed in the legislative framework to address that is to acknowledge that the kind of human-centered spending limit approach to limiting third parties doesn't work as well potentially in an AI world. I hope that's helpful to you.
It is, thank you. And is there a way then to require, let's say, labeling AI-generated content, possibly during election time? Can that be enforced without stifling legitimate political expression? Is there a way of doing that and balancing that during an election campaign?
There is, I think. I mean, I would say that you already have labeling of political ads, right? So the way Elections Canada's legal framework works, or the way the Canada Elections Act framework works when we're regulating speech during elections, is parties have to take accountability for the ads they put in place by indicating that they've been approved by the agent of the party. And third parties who are operating within the law also have to disclose who's behind the advertisement, and they have to subject themselves to limits. So, and the way you do that is you do make the broadcasters and the platforms comply with certain restrictions when labeled content is put out, right? And with the requirement to not post unlabeled content that is an election advertisement. So you can extend that part of it, I think, relatively easily. And then the second thing you can do is you could pass legislation that would similarly prohibit the platforms and the networks from disseminating information which looks like election advertising by third parties, even if it is produced by agents rather than by humans.
Thank you. In the time I have left, in your opening statement, sir, you referred to the longest ballot as in the fact that management of elections are highly localized, and the concern that I have on this committee is the rights of peoples to vote. Can you explain that point, that the management of election highly localized and the challenges that were faced and the possible challenges to people's right to vote?
Yes. What's remarkable about Canadian elections is how amateur they are and how well run they are, right? That all of our local polling places are staffed by people who are paid, but they're essentially temporary people working to serve our democracy. And they're doing it in kind of the most important civic activity that we do. So I've always found that kind of interesting. But the challenge is that if voters walk into a polling place and they're confronted by 1,000 names on a ballot or 200 names on a ballot, it makes it challenging for election workers to explain the ballot to them, and it makes it challenging for them to help the voters do what the voters intend to do. Voters are not there to cast a ballot for some obscure person who got onto the ballot through a signature harvesting exercise. They're there to vote for one of the major parties, or maybe a real independent local candidate or a local notable, or a small party that's trying to break through. So if voters are going there and they're told, look, voting is straightforward, trust us that you can do this, and suddenly they're confronted with a meter-long ballot, it erodes, at least at the margin, their sense of democratic efficacy, and it makes it hard for the people running elections. I'm sure it's frustrating to explain where to look for the people who are actually running for office on that ballot.
Interject, I do apologize, Mr. Lewis is over time. Thank you so much. Madame Normandin, and yes, if you can put in your earpiece.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thanks to both the witnesses. Professor, let me start with asking questions of you. In your opening remarks, you started by saying that the longest ballot committee is violating the spirit of the elections a tad. Now, I'd like to hear your thoughts about the balance that should be struck between the right of an individual to run and also to run on their ideas, by extension, and the right of citizens to have elections, the spirit of which is to elect someone who would be fit to represent them. So how do you strike that fine balance between the right to run, to bring your ideas to the fore, and also to have elections, the spirit of which is laudable and praiseworthy?
I think the ballots in Canada... Pardon me. Okay, are we okay? I think ballots in Canada most certainly should have a place for non-major party candidates, right? And I think that it's really wonderful that people step up to run in elections when they probably know that they don't actually have much of a chance of winning, depending on their party and their geography of where they are. And I think that is an important part of our democratic exercise. Those are sincere people, and other people have will often step forward because they're animated by some issue that really matters to them, and they want to express that issue. That's different than people who are not running to be a contestant in the election as their principal motivator, but who are instead running, really adding their name to the ballot because they want to make a larger point. And I think that is the animating spirit of the longest ballot committee. They want to gum up the ballot with as many names as possible to make a point that's different than standing in an election because you have certain views. So I think you can certainly strike a legislative sweet spot, which makes it possible for local people who want to run for the sake of running, even if they're not a part of a major party, to get on that ballot by earnestly seeking a large number of signatures, while tailoring the rules to not allow for the monkeying of ballots by allowing, for example, one individual or one group to capture signatures for hundreds of people.
Merci. Et j'ai envie d'aller justement...
Thank you. I'd just like to drill down on that issue of striking a balance that you just alluded to, the difference between bringing to the fore ideas and using the ballot as a pressure tactic. Now, you referred to the fact that there might be less serious candidates in any given election. I might for example, think of the Rhinoceros Party that presents kind of far-fetched ideas and, in fact, are a protest candidate in some ways. It's a way of casting a donkey vote. So how can one judge what is kind of a little bit funny and what is actually unacceptable and egregious in the context of an election?
I think it's a great question, and I think, like many things, you know it when you see it. So let's contrast the Rhinoceros Party in its heyday with what's going on here. The Rhinoceros Party would run candidates across the whole country. They would do the work of getting a single candidate on the ballot. Then they would put out a platform which was rather satirical and funny, putting up a wall to keep killer bees from coming from the United States, or removing the Rocky Mountains so you could coast from coast to coast on a bicycle. All these ideas are funny, and I don't think that they ever impaired the ability of other voters to cast ballots to find their candidates. But this is something different. This is not even about the idea of elections. This is a committee which believes that we should have a different electoral system, despite constant demonstrations that Canadians don't want that, and constitutional affirmations that our electoral system is democratic. And because they're not getting it, they've decided to essentially gum up our electoral system at the level of the ballot. So I guess part of the distinction here is that it's having a material cost on how ballots are designed and experienced, and it's not actually about the election, is it? It's not actually about making fun of the process of whatever election we're in or some particular issue. It's about gumming up the process, and that just strikes me as perhaps something different than being a satirical candidate out to get a laugh.
Justement, considérant que l'idée...
Considering that the idea being floated by the longest ballot committee is to have electoral overhaul, could one, for example, create a party for electoral reform and run or field a number of candidates in certain ridings for the 45th Parliament, for example?
That's a great party platform to run on if you think it's an important issue that will then be taken up in Parliament. I don't think you'll win, but sure, someone could try to start that party.
Et à ce moment-là, est-ce que ce serait une façon peut-être...
So, in that sense, would that be a good way of taking the pulse of the public to see what demand there is for electoral overhaul and how well such a party could perform? Given that the general public really doesn't have a real sense of the views that are being touted by the largest ballot committee.
Yeah, I think if a party wants to test a single issue, an election is one way to do it. And if a party wanted to run purely on electoral reform, they could give it a go. It would certainly be a more sincere effort than this one.
Jackson, 5 minutes, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just to confirm with you, Mr. Shukevich, in your submission to the committee, it said that whoever wrote the submission, I'm not sure if that was you, said that they watched the testimony from the Chief Electoral Officer last week. So just wanting to confirm if that was you that authored that document or not, and did you watch the Chief Electoral Officer's testimony last week?
Yeah, my brother and I wrote that document. And yeah, I watched the testimony last week.
Okay. So you'll have seen then that the Chief Electoral Officer testified last week that your actions in various constituencies, whether it be general or by-election, affect every voter's access to vote, but the actions of your organization particularly hurt and block the ability of seniors and folks with disabilities to be able to cast their ballot. Those who are born with additional needs and the seniors who built this country should not have barriers put in their way by a political stunt that has no motivation or request from the public to change our electoral system. So what kind of an organization would try to prevent those most vulnerable in our society and our seniors from being able to access their constitutional right to vote?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, that's a great question. So as we all know, the design of federal ballots is prescribed by the Election Act, which is written by you MPs. So I'm not aware of any documented cases of people actually being prevented from voting because of too many candidates. I am aware of existing accessibility concerns surrounding the voting process. The Canadian National Institute for the Blind gave a series of recommendations to this very committee on improving accessibility when Bill C-65 was being discussed. I would point out that none of their recommendations have been implemented by you, and I would also point out that none of their recommendations involved arbitrarily restricting citizens' rights to run as a candidate. So I'm not an expert on accessible ballot design, so I would suggest that you talk to the disability advocates for that.
Well, thank you, Chair. I think the Chief Electoral Officer has spoken to disability advocates and has heard multiple complaints. The number of complaints about this election were higher than it has been before, which was also presented as part of his testimony. So whether or not it's the end goal of your organization, this is the result that people had a more difficult time casting their ballot in this election, both in the Battle River Crowfoot by-election and in the general election, than ever before. And they were predominantly seniors who had to wait in longer lines and found the sometimes meter-long ballot more inaccessible, or people with disabilities, including, as you mentioned, people that are vision impaired. So these actions have caused people not only to be unable to wait in the line longer to vote, but also required in many cases no longer their ability to privately vote because they required assistance in the ballot box in order to manage the ballot that your organization forced to be so unwieldy that they could not manage it on their own. Why would you take these actions? And what do you have to say to those Canadians who had their privacy breached because of their inability to manage the ballot on their own because of your campaign's actions?
Mr. Speaker, I would, again, I don't design the ballots. The ballot design is written in the Elections Act, which means you MPs actually design the ballot. And if the Chief Electoral Officer was following the will of Parliament, then it actually would have been twice as long in those two-column situations. Of course, for operational reasons, understandably, he had to make emergency amendments to the Elections Act in order to not make it like 4 meters long. So yeah, if you're concerned about accessible ballot design, I strongly suggest you talk to disability advocates, because I'm not an expert on this, and I have no power to change the design of the ballot.
Well, sir, with respect, you do have the ability to stop your committee's actions from blowing up our ballots to achieve a political goal where there is no political consensus in this country to change our electoral system. The professors already noted it. You have a Liberal Party that campaigned on it in 2015 and then backed away from it because they recognized that there was no willingness to change the electoral system from anywhere near a consensus or even close to a majority of Canadians. So you're wasting everybody's time and in the process harming some of our most vulnerable Canadians' ability to participate in Canada's democracy.
Okay, I will interject there as it is 5 minutes. Perhaps Mr. Shukevich, you can answer that in subsequent questions that may come up. So we will move along to Madame Kayabaga, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to thank our witnesses for being here today. Just a question for Dr. Lowen. Do you think that there are any empirical studies in Canada or anywhere else in the world that show that the ballot length affects voter error rates, any spoilage, turnout, and including the ability for voters to understand the ballot and how that impacts or doesn't impact their decision making?
Thank you for asking. It's a literature I used to know better about 15 or 20 years ago. So I don't want to characterize all of it, but I'll just say two things about it. One is that ballot design effects are generally small. So very rarely do ballot design effects matter for the outcome of an election. So I think we should be clear about that. There are, however, a few notable irregularities. One is that ballots that are alphabetically ordered favor people who are at the top of the ballot, and there's fairly well established empirics on ballot order mattering. So people who are closer to the top of a ballot matter more, and then length of ballot is thought to increase those effects, because the longer a ballot is, the more likely you might be to just sort of say, "Oh, come on, this is too much. I'll just go for someone near the top." That said, a lot of that comes out of studies in the United States where you've got a lot of different offices that you're voting for at once, for example. The most, of course, notable case, right, was that there's pretty good empirical evidence that in Palm Beach County in 2000, Al Gore or Pat Buchanan won that county because of the ballot design, and they had a so-called butterfly ballot, which opened up like this, and it was unclear which person you were voting for on which side of the ledger, which is kind of a famous example of how a ballot design can lead to unintended effects. But the long story short is, I think the effects of this would be small, but the frustration for voters could be real in having to confront a ballot of hundreds of names, which we've never really seen before in Canada.
And just a quick question on that. What kind of reforms do you think would sort of bear the lengthy ballots, especially if they're impeding someone's right to vote and to understand the ballot and the kind of impacts that they may have on that decision making?
I think the tension you have here in designing the legislation is how high of a bar do you set that makes this kind of gumming up the ballot very difficult, but yet is not too high that a sincere candidate who may not have the backing of a party, or who may have the backing of a party that's not popular in that part of the country, can still get over that bar. I will tell you that the thing that stuck out to me as I learned more about this was the idea that a single agent can act on behalf of multiple candidates. And I think that most Canadians would find that curious. We understand that elections are competitive processes between teams of people. So the idea that you would have one coach, or one manager for multiple teams, I think rightfully strikes people as against the competitive spirit of the election and suggests that this is something other than candidates who want to contest the election. And I think that's clear, even from what the committee has said, that they're not actually about putting up competitive candidates. They're about making a larger point that they want a different electoral system from the one that we have.
Switching the gears a little bit around political financing, I just want to hear your thoughts on the risk of foreign influence through political financing, and what you think are the many vulnerabilities that exist in our political financing regime right now.
It's a good question. It's one on which I'm not an expert, so you will hear from other people who are experts on it. I think that the biggest vulnerability is a little bit of what I articulated to Mr. Lewis, but put slightly differently, that just as the costs of communicating go down, the ability of people to use small amounts of money to influence our elections is is greater than it was before, right? And the idea that it would be impossible for a person from Russia to put an ad on the CBC or CTV, right? But it's not impossible for them to put one on Twitter. So the permeability of platforms versus broadcast networks and radio networks is, I think, probably the most serious vulnerability. That's less about where the money's coming from, and it's about the ability of money to be put to speech on these platforms.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Madame Kayabaga. We will proceed to Madame Normandin, but just keeping in mind that we are approaching noon, but we do have a little bit of extra time, so I will add another minute to the remaining three questioners. So 3.5 minutes, Madame Normandin.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Some questions for you, Mr. Shukovich, if I may. The idea behind the longest ballot committee is to be militant with a view to having electoral overhaul or reform. I'd like to hear your thoughts. What's your perception about the ability of your message to actually percolate up in the public and cut through? Have your efforts really hit their mark to date?
Thank you for the question. Mr. Chair, I think me being invited here is pretty good evidence that we've been very successful. We get lots of media attention, and just at a basic level, whenever I talk to someone and say, hey, did you know politicians write the rules of their own election? They say, oh, that's stupid. So it clicks with people right away. It's very obviously a conflict of interest.
Je vais reformuler ma question.
I'll reformulate my question, take another stab at it. Folks are aware of the existence of the longest ballot committee, but in your opinion, do they really understand the message that you are championing when it comes to electoral reform?
Yeah, I think people do understand the message. It's very straightforward that politicians are obviously in a conflict of interest when they are in charge of writing the rules for their own elections. Sorry. It's a very simple message, and people understand it and generally agree with me, unless they have partisan interests.
Je comprends qu'une des façons
Now, I understand that one way of determining the success of your company or your organisation is by your presence here today. What are the other indicators as far as your message cutting through and percolating up in the public?
Like I said, we get a lot of media attention. It's really great. We get a lot of candidates putting themselves out there and doing media interviews. We've got international attention for the first person to get 0 votes in history, so that was very cool. We get lots of positive messages. People are always happy to see what we're doing, and they want to join next time. So I think it's been very positive, and people really resonate with the message that politicians shouldn't be in charge of the rules of their own elections.
Au risque de me répéter, vous l'avez mentionné.
At risk of repeating myself, you mentioned that one way of determining or calculating the success of your organisation is by way of your presence here today. Do you really get the sense that your presence here today is tangibly contributing to your demand for an overhaul of the electoral system? Or on the contrary, are you in fact discrediting this issue, which is in other respects legitimate and quite praiseworthy?
So like I was saying, people with partisan interests obviously don't want to hear that election laws should be decided by non-partisan bodies. It's great. You people are in charge of the Elections Act, and I get to be right in here in front of you and telling you, maybe you shouldn't be. This is very positive.
Merci beaucoup. I'd like to thank Madame Normandin. She is always on time and keeping track of the time, something for all of us to strive towards. So, merci beaucoup. Mr. Calkins, for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I always appreciate hearing from Canadians, particularly those who think we shouldn't have politicians making laws. They think that other people should be making laws other than people who are actually elected and accountable and re-accountable to the electorate. I fail to see the logic, to be quite frank with you. given the fact, as my colleague Mr. Jackson said, even when the Liberals had a majority in 2015 to 2019 and proposed electoral reform, the Canadian public actually, through their elected representatives, decide whether or not something is going to be palatable. And that's how we actually go through the sausage-making effort of making laws, regulations, including laws regarding our elections being at this particular committee. Anybody with a basic understanding of a civics class would know that. But I'm going to ask my first question to Mr. Lowen. Mr. Lowen, in 2017, an Alberta court decision ruled that a provision in our electoral laws requiring a $1,000 deposit was a violation of the Charter on Rights and Freedoms. Do you, first of all, I think you would agree that elections are serious business. I don't think there's a more serious thing that a Canadian can do than cast their ballot in the democratic process. We're approaching Veterans Week and Remembrance Day. Over 120,000 Canadians have paid with their lives in order to make sure that we can all do this. This is serious business. It's about as serious business as it gets. I always interpreted that $1,000 requirement to be something put in place to make sure that unserious people weren't able to just get their name on the ballot. Do you think the government made a mistake by not challenging or trying to challenge that decision made by an Alberta court in 2017?
I have to confess I'm not deeply fluent with the case, so I don't know the jurisprudential argument for it. It strikes me as an entirely reasonable limit of $1,000. What I will say is that Canadian elections are cheap. I know it seems like perhaps I don't know actually whether MPs feel like they're spending a lot of money or not, but I do know that many of you raise more money than you can spend, and we also have examples of candidates who can win without spending a lot of money. I think it's great that for the most part we've put pretty serious caps on our election spending, so that who wins is not determined purely by who raises more money. Now, where those exact limits are, Mr. Calkins, I'm not sure, but I do think that that $1,000 clearly that $1,000 deposit plus changes in the signatures or the ease of signatures and the fact that one could be an agent for multiple candidates does make the ballot probably more permeable than is desirable, as evidenced by the ballots in the last election.
Thank you for that. You've answered the second part of my question as to whether or not you think that should be put back in place. I don't know if there's a possibility to do that now, given the fact that I think the time for challenging that court decision has elapsed. Do you think that in order to protect the integrity of our electoral system and treat it with the seriousness that it deserves, that this committee should look at the definition of registered third parties and to make sure that this is obviously a very organized effort? Is there anything that you would advise us to do with the definition of a third party?
Yes, I mean I think this is critically important, and I'll note that your party has a history of being the least supportive of regulations on third parties. And I'm not saying it to score a point or anything, but I think I raise it, Mr. Calkins, to note that I think we've come to a consensus in the country, even among your party, that it's good to have elections contested principally among political parties without huge outside influence, and I think that's a good thing. And I actually changed my own opinion on it over time. So as the cost of advertising changes and as the tactics of third parties change, I think it is worth asking whether legislation is fit for purpose to achieve what the overall animating principle is in Canadian elections, which is that elections should be a conversation between parties and voters without the cacophonous entry of hundreds of other people into that conversation.
Thank you very much. Now to Mr. Shushevich. The Chief Elections Officer, Mr. Perot, told the committee that people should face penalties for signing multiple nomination papers. Would you agree with that statement?
I believe that was one of his suggestions. I don't really see a reason for that. I don't really see the logic in it. Personally, I prefer it when there's more than one candidate on the ballot. So I should be able, as a voter, to nominate more than one candidate.
You're aware that Section 480.1, subsection 1, says every person is guilty of an offense who with intent mislead falsely represents themselves to be or causes anyone to falsely represent them to be i.e. a candidate or a person who is authorized to act on a candidate's behalf, would you agree that asking somebody to sign a nomination paper that has all candidates written at the top or no candidate's name would be a false representation under the Act?
No, I'm not a legal expert, but I don't believe it was. Of course, the returning officer determined that that wasn't acceptable to be, like the candidates couldn't get accepted based on those forms, and so they were refused, and that's fine.
Also in the Elections Act, Section 482(1), every person is guilty of an offence who obstructs or hinders or knowingly makes, either orally or in writing, a false or misleading statement to the Commissioner of Elections of Canada Elections or any person acting under his or her direction, while the Commissioner or the person acting under his or her direction is exercising or performing powers, duties, or functions conferred or imposed upon the Commissioner under this Act. So that's obstruction. Do you think any of the actions of your committee have actually obstructed and met the definition here for obstruction under Elections Canada? And have you been given any warnings? Have you been given any reprimands? And have you been threatened with charges by Elections Canada?
Certainly not to any of those questions. I've never been reprimanded and have no intention of misleading anyone. We have nothing to hide. We do everything by the book.
My colleague,
Thank you very much, Mr. Calkins.
Thank you, Chair.
Go now to Madame Brière. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you to our two witnesses for being with us here today. Professor Lowen, we know that it is difficult to get people to take the leap and go into politics, particularly women. Do you think that the Longest Ballot Committee's tactics in any way make it even tougher for people to take that leap and enter politics?
I'm not sure. Because I think the effects are probably small, I suspect that they aren't. That it's not having a huge effect there, though it could be having one. But I think that the notion that elections are kind of something that you play with strikes me as degrading at all. So perhaps that makes it less appealing to both male and female candidates. But I'm not sure that it would have a differential effect on women.
Okay. Thank you. Merci. Est-ce que aussi vous croyez...
Now, do you believe that it is too easy to get your name on the ballot in any riding whatsoever, in the sense that you only need 100 signatures and get an official agent? We know that the Longest Ballot Committee's actions have led to a lot of chaos in recent elections, including by-elections. So do you think that we need to take a stand against these kinds of actions, or should we just allow the status quo to play out, or should we be thinking about a more in-depth overhaul of our electoral process?
I think that it seems clear to me that the combination of 100 signatures plus allowing a small group of people, one person, two people, to harvest the signatures necessary to get candidates on is leading to ballots that are too long. Now, I guess the choice you have is whether you legislate against that directly, right, or whether you just hope that this goes away. And that's kind of a serious choice about what you want to spend your legislative time on. I will just tell you that in my professional opinion, I think it's hard to sustain an argument that this behavior is desirable for democracy. I don't think it's good that people are using the ballot principally for something other than putting up candidates in front of people. It's not a petition, and it's not a social media stunt. It's the presentation of people who want to represent other people in office and are willing to go out there and put their ideas to the test. So it just it offends me a little bit. Now, whether or not you should spend time legislating against it or not, that's another question. But I could certainly see why you would.
Merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Zukovic, if I may. Can you hear me? You can, good. So your actions have been described as in many different ways, in fact, and you said that you're happy to be here today and to have gotten politicians' attention. Do you really think that what you are doing is achieving your true objectives, or do you think instead that we should sit down around a table and have an in-depth, good faith discussion about what your goals are, i.e. electoral reform at the end of the day?
Yes, thank you for the question. This committee has mandate over election law and conflict of interest, so yes, this is the perfect place for you all to be discussing whether or not it's appropriate for MPs to be writing the rules of their own elections.
C'est bon. I'm okay. No, it's okay.
Thank you so much, Madame Briere. I will exercise my ability as chair to ask a question, and it's picking up on what Mr. Culkins was alluding to with appointing people who would seemingly not be accountable. I know in our system, and I think you even spoke about it in terms of the Elections Canada being respected. The executive appoints a nominee to be the head of Elections Canada, and an organization that's independent like the RCMP is appointed and then is accountable to Parliament. It worries me that you're proposing an agency that may not be accountable. Who are these individuals who would be appointed to this committee? I guess is my question, if it wasn't going to be politicians or the executive who was going to make that appointment.
Yep, that's a fantastic question. I'm not a policy expert. It's very obvious to everyone that it's inappropriate for conflict of interest for MPs to be in charge of it. So I'm extremely confident that if you had an in-depth discussion about it, you could come up with something very reasonable.
So well, I guess I'll leave it as a comment that it's very bizarre to me that you're engaging in this protest without the very basic answer to the first question that would come up in solving what you are seeking to protest. But I appreciate you appearing before the committee. We will suspend for a few minutes to set up for the next panel.